Well, thank you for coming back this morning. I'm Williams Whitney. I'm director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. I'm just delighted that you've joined us the second day. We will have 4 talks today on the Lincoln track, and we hope that you can make each of them. Our next talk is by Professor Scott Stabler. Scott Stabler is somebody dear to my heart because, first of all, he's a fellow Texan. He's from Houston, and as his dad came up here and said, it snows regularly in Houston, once every 14 years. Scott is, as I say, he's a Texan. He went to Baylor University for his undergraduate. He went to the University of Houston for his master's degree. And he went to Arizona State for his PhD. And he did his graduate work on grant in Indian policy. So we have somebody who really can speak very well to the topic this morning, which is Native Americans and the Great Emancipator. Scott Stabler.
Thanks. How are we doing?
Gotta use this.
Oh. There are 2 books about Lincoln and Indians, and both are like 30 years old, so there's already time for any of you that have new ideas to write a book about Lincoln and Indians. And as Gleave said, I wrote well, I'll talk about that in a minute, but let's go to the next one, Brian, please. It's kind of my outline for today. The Lincoln legacy and myth, because people think that Abraham Lincoln was the great emancipator and great humanitarian. Well, among my Dakota friends, that's very debatable. And among American Indians, it's very debatable about how great Abraham Lincoln is. The second part is the inevitable great push west. I think since Columbus, there's been this inevitability of a push west. And a lot of people try to make American Indians victims and the government the perpetrator of these terrible crimes, when the reality is it's the people like you and me that push west that lead to the inevitability, and actually the government a lot of times is fairly paternal and somewhat altruistic, which is a new notion to a lot of people. We have to remember Lincoln is a Midwesterner. What his goals are prior to becoming president are much different than someone that would be in the New England area or someone that would be in the West, or definitely an American Indian. Fourth part is Lincoln the president. Very practical. Dealing with American Indians has to deal with the Civil War at the same time. Too often we try to separate Indian policy from the war. The reality is that Lincoln's focus is on the war. But he also deals with American Indians very regularly. Every delegation that comes to Washington, D.C., he will meet with. The Dakota War is the most famous war during his time. We'll talk about that. It's called the Great Sioux Uprising, but of course the word Sioux is a misnomer. It's a French word that's not even in the Dakota language. So it's pretty much changed to the Dakota War. And War in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, Kansas is like a mini civil war throughout Lincoln's presidency, and how he deals with that is fairly interesting. And then we'll conclude. So, go ahead, Brian, thanks. Why am I here? Well, first of all, I used to teach high school. That was my second job out of college. And I think it talks a lot about things that will apply to your high school students or elementary students about inevitability, that some things are just inevitable. It'll talk about the role of victimization and how people being victims or the agents of their own change. So, how I explain that is Custer's Last Stand. Let me give you an example of Custer's Last Stand. Everybody's heard of Custer's Last Stand, right? So Custer originally went to the Black Hills to search to see if there was actually gold there, because what's happening is about 1,000 miners a month are rushing into the Black Hills of the Dakotas, believing that there's gold there. The problem is, under a treaty, that's Sioux land, or Lakota land, Lakota mostly. And thus, whites can't enter that land. But Grant, being president at the time, feels like, well, I got to find if there's really gold there. These people making it up. There's really gold there. There's no great veins of gold, kind of like California. There are no great veins of gold that ever really came out of California. So Grant sends Custer, U.S. Geological Survey guy, and his son on this survey into the Black Hills illegally to see if there's actually gold in the Black Hills. Well, what finds out is they come back to Washington. The report issued by the USGS guy, supported by Grant's son, is there is no gold in the Black Hills. However, Custer and all his little reporters he has carried along with him say, oh, that's just Grant trying to avoid a war. There really is gold in the Black Hills. Of course, what do the reporters report? There is gold in the Black Hills. And so everybody, there's gold in those hills. So actually more miners flood into the Black Hills after Custer's report, or after the report's officially issued. And Grant actually orders the soldiers to burn wagons of any miner entering the Black Hills and take them to the nearest fort. So that's the order. Tell Sheridan to do that. And they actually do that. They're burning white people's wagons to prevent them from entering Indian lands. But if you know how big the Black Hills are, in that area, it's not real easy to cordon off, and there's 1,000 a month. Then if you know what the post-war army looks like, the demographic of the post-war army under Grant is going to be mostly immigrant, mostly poor, and those guys, they see it as a free trip into the Black Hills. So what happens when Grant orders that is he orders more soldiers there, and the desertion rate exceeds 50%. Because those soldiers get the free trip out there with the army, and then they just flood into the Black Hills. So now, as Grant, I always tell my students, what do you do? Because the Sioux are, the Lakota are killing white people that go into their lands, illegally going into their lands, and they'll kill them. But as we know, trespassing and death, I don't know if I call it murder, but trespassing and killing somebody, there's not exactly balanced crimes, right? So what do you do? If you do what, Al?
I would say you would do something to protect the whites who are going into the...
Okay, you do the same thing. You protect the whites that go in. So what Grant do, he actually offers the Sioux more land in Indian territory and more money in annuities. But as you know, Sitting Bull and the Lakota find the Black Hills sacred and deny that and turn that down. Thus, Grant orders all Lakota onto reservations and sends Custer out in his last stand. And gets killed in Montana, not in the Black Hills. So the inevitability, what do you do about white people flooding into those lands? And you can't really stop it. I mean, that's been a dilemma from Bacon's Rebellion, right? The Bacon's guys flood into the indentured servants going to Indian lands, and Berkeley's making a ton of money off the fur trade. The Proclamation Line of 1763, if you remember the American Revolution, after Pontiac's revolt, which is right around, well, a few hundred miles over that way, right? They draw the Proclamation Line, which is all the way along the Appalachians. That doesn't do well. It actually leads to the American Revolution, correct? Then it's Jackson, with the removal policy, actually does the same thing Grant does and orders. Did I break something? Jackson orders the wagons to be burned. All those people are entering Georgia and the Gold Hills, but people keep flooding into Georgia, and so Jackson orders removal, and then Grant has the same dilemma. And I'd argue that that is the dilemma of American history. What do you do? The government can only do so much. And so I think that's really good to think about students and how much we look to the federal government for change and how much change the federal government can actually do. Because Grant hates Custer. Especially because he lied about what his son had said. And he's actually in jail in Chicago right before his last stand, because every time you had to go to D.C., you had to see the president. That was a rule. If you were an officer, you had to see the commanding general of the army, or the president. Well, Custer comes into town to testify against Grant's brother, Homer Grant, who has been ripping off the Indians in the West. And of course, that doesn't go well with Grant. And so Grant puts Custer off in his office for a few days, and he can't go see the commanding general of the army because whereas Sherman, he hates Washington, D.C., and he's moved to St. Louis. So Custer eventually just writes a note to Grant saying, I came by to see you, you weren't available, I left. So at the train, the sergeant-at-arms for the local militia there in Chicago actually had Custer arrested. Because Custer wanted to go with his men. He knew the expedition was going to take place. And Custer spends a couple days in jail before Sheridan and Sherman bug Grant to death until let Custer go. And when he lets Custer go, then of course he fulfills the mission he wanted anyway and gets him killed. And in his inaugural address the next year, because 76 is when Custer's last stand, so his State of the Union is 77, he actually blames white people for Custer's last stand and blames Custer to some extent as well. So this idea that the government is always victimizing the Indians is kind of far-fetched, and the idea that the Indians are always innocent is also kind of far-fetched. Now, does ends justify the means? Well, not necessarily. So that's kind of my background as far as what I study as a historian of American Indian policy, which is kind of unique because we've gone from the D. Brown world of victimization to this idea of full agency without any government input, and today it's really a mix of the two. And my master's thesis is on Grant and American Indians, and so that's kind of where I'm coming from.